Alright, it's time to talk about Coup de Grace. So this is the 8th Firefly novel from Titan Books, and this one was written by Una McCormack, who also wrote the 5th book, Carnival. This review won't include plot-heavy spoilers, but in order to express my opinions and feelings, I may give away some of the broader strokes of the novel. So, my overall opinion of this one? Like the last few entries, I think it's pretty good in its own right, on its own merit, but lacks anything that makes it feel particularly important or part of a bigger series. So let's start with the positive thoughts. As we already knew from Carnival, McCormack is very good at crafting a world. In this novel, the crew are called to the border planet of Able, which is a very frontier/farming sort of world. Now, to me, the town and planet felt very real and lived in. I could understand very easily what sort of place this was and how it fit into the larger cosmos of the Firefly universe. The character voices are decent, and this might sound like faint praise, and in some sense it is. If you've seen my review of Carnival, the thing I singled out as most exceptional in that novel was just how good McCormack realised the voices of the characters. They really felt like the versions that we've seen on the screen. The one thing that got me most excited for Coup de Grace was getting more of that fantastic dialogue, and honestly I was a little bit disappointed on that front. The voices are still good, but they just didn't feel quite as natural as they did in Carnival. I really liked the guest main character of Annie Roberts. She felt totally at home in the Firefly universe, and I enjoyed that her scenes were narrated from her first-person perspective. That's something we've not really seen before in this novel series, and in fact I think they might have missed the trick. If the whole novel had been exclusively from Annie's perspective, I think it might have proved a more distinctive and memorable entry in the series to me. It would have felt maybe like one of those slightly special episodes where the formula is played with a little. So think of Buffy episodes like The Zeppo or Storyteller. I also think that a disservice was done by not including her on the cover alongside Mal, like Jane was included next to Jane in the Magnificent Nine's cover. Like Carnival, I think I need to praise Coup de Grace for treating River properly. If you've listened to other reviews of mine, you'll know I have a very low opinion regarding how most of the Firefly novels treat River as too sane and too kick-ass, but thankfully here her depiction is very similar to how she's shown in the original show. So that's good. So now the things that I'm less than thrilled about. I think the characters could have been mixed up a little more. Just like in Carnival, in Coup, the crew splits up into teams, and the combinations are just quite predictable and played out in my opinion. We've got the combat team of Mal, Zoe and Jane, the engineering team of Wash and Kaylee, the fancy duds team of Inara and Simon, and the stay-at-home team of Book and River. And I'm not saying that we should just roll some dice and mix the characters up randomly, but I think we've seen these combinations already in the show and in other novels, and going into the 8th novel, I think some new types of interactions would help keep things interesting. For instance, I'm going to say some combos, and see if you can think of any meaningful interactions that we've already seen between these two characters. So, Wash and Book, Zoe and Kaylee, Jane and Inara, Simon and Zoe, River and Wash. There's a lot more interpersonal interactions between crew members that we haven't seen much before that I think could be an untapped goldmine for these novels. Yeah, it's maybe more difficult to justify why those characters would be paired up, but it's not impossible. So, once again, I felt like the scale of the story was a little off. In the original show, nothing the crew does has consequences that extend much further than a small village community. The novels often forget this, and the consequences are blown up too much, and suddenly the stakes are whole countries or planets in peril. Although it wasn't the case in Carnival, I think McCormack is guilty of this scene in Coup de Grace. The in-universe consequences of the plot are at least planet-wide, and arguably reach all the way up and into the Alliance government. Another thing I heavily praised about Carnival was how few continuity errors it contained. My praise is a little more muted here. The continuity errors are few and minor, but there are a handful that I spotted. I don't want to nitpick them here because I tend to find minor continuity errors to be a pretty boring topic. Instead, I'll mention two possible continuity errors, but more as debating points rather than gotchas. So, firstly, on page 238, River seems to sense the pain of another character, despite being separated by a significant distance. Now, I could well be wrong here, but I don't recall there being anything in the show or movie that suggests that her psychic abilities have this sort of range. Admittedly, her capabilities are somewhat ill-defined in the show and do vary a little episode to episode. However, I don't think we see her access another person's thoughts or feelings at a great distance. As a rule of thumb, I think I'd have suggested that her ability to hear thoughts probably has a range roughly that of a regular human ear hearing a regular human voice. So if she could hear you shouting, she can probably reach your thoughts. But miles away, you're safe. Now that's just my vague impression, and I've not combed through every instance of her mind-reading abilities before, so I might well be wrong about this. The second point to mull over is that on page 260, where Mal says, "War ain't over. It'll never be over." I was a bit shocked to read this, because I think it betrays a deep misunderstanding of Mal. For Mal, the war is over. He's accepted that the Independents lost, and he's moved on to the next thing in his life. That's kind of what Firefly is all about. Firefly isn't about the war. It's about what happens to people after the war is done. I mean, look at this scene from the movie.
You're the Browncoats, eh? Fought for independence? Petty thieving ain't exactly soldiers' work.
War's long done. All just folk now.
Exactly what is Mal's philosophy is probably an interesting topic for your discussion, but my initial gut reaction is that McCormack got this one wrong. Now, it's maybe becoming a bit of a boring point, but it has to be said. Titan, enough of the Save the Town plotlines. This is now the third novel in a row, and the fourth overall, which has used Save the Town. This plot archetype involves the crew arriving on a new planet, discovering the existence of some villain causing trouble for the local people, defeating the villain, and saving the town slash city slash country slash planet. Now, I get why this plot is attractive for a standalone tie-in novel. You can create stakes that don't need to have any impact on the crew, and it's plausible to assume that everything that happens in the novel never needs to be discussed ever again, because it's mostly someone else's problems they were solving, not their own issues. But honestly, I'm finding that Titan returning to this well so many times is wearying. Right? It really makes me feel like there's just no creativity or ambition at play when Titan is deciding what to build their story around. And to be clear, I do get that there's a difference between story and plot. I'm not for a second saying that the stories are getting repetitive, but the plot archetypes are. And I'm someone who's probably in the top 1% of fans of these novels. I'm investing the time to talk about them on the internet, after all. And even I noticed a distinct drop in my excitement level for Coup de Grace, both when it was first announced and while I was reading it. You need to shake things up. Another old complaint I feel I have to mention again, timeline placement. This is another novel set after the series and before Those Left Behind. That's now 3 novels jammed into this space in the timeline, despite the fact it should be a reasonably small gap. Inara specifically says she doesn't want to draw out the process of leaving Serenity in the last episode, but we do seem to always be able to draw it out for another novel if required. Like, it's not as if there's not other places in the timeline that have space. Between Our Mrs. Reynolds and Trash, there's approximately half a year, and only 4 episodes filling it. Like, I know this is a relatively minor grievance, but it just seems such a small hurdle to overcome. Titan presumably wants people to think of these novels as canon. Well, the bare minimum required to achieve that goal is surely that they make sense fitting in with the original episodes. At the moment, if someone asks me if these novels are canon, my honest answer is something along the lines of, the novels are largely very good, but mostly don't make sense as canon. And that's coming from someone who's, as I said, a pretty big fan of these novels as a whole. So, where does Coup de Grace rank compared with the others? It's probably somewhere near the middle. I think it's solid, it's an enjoyable read, but without much reason to get very excited about it, it doesn't really bring anything particularly new to the table. I would probably say it's around 5th between The Magnificent Nine and Life Signs, but that's just my current feelings, and my thinking does evolve. So, That's my thoughts on Coup de Grace. Going by Titan's previous passions, I'd expect to see the announcement of the ninth book quite soon, and I'll probably try to make a video once the blurb has been released. I also intend to make a video discussing the recurring problems of the series as a whole. I've just not really figured out how to make that interesting and not just a rant about timelines and continuity. But until then, thanks for listening.